Welcome to the next installment of my series of quilt block tutorials. Today we are going to learn how to make the cat's cradle and a few variations. Here is one variation, and here is another, and you'll notice it looks very similar to this one, just a little corner is right there is different, but when they sewed in the block, they're going to look the same. And then there's this interesting one. So we're going to learn how to make all three of these today. Let's go over first some standard things about my tutorials. As a general rule, my measurements that I write are exact. You're very rarely going to be making anything oversized and trim it down. And when there are exceptions, I will tell you this is not one of them. Also want to let you know I have a distinct dislike for sewing unsupported bias seams because those are way too easy to stretch them out. So instead of having you cut triangles, you'll notice there is a lot of triangles in this piece, but I'm not having you cut triangles. We're cutting squares and rectangles and sewing diagonally and then cutting after we sew. And as a standard practice of all quilt writers, not just me, we give our measurements in finished sizes. That is the size you will see after it is sewn into your quilt, your project. So we're going to call this a 6-inch block, but if you measured it, it would be 6.5 because there's a 1/4 inch seam allowance all the way around. So let's get started with this. First of all, let's talk about I'm going to write this so that you can do this with just any regular ruler that has a 45-degree line printed on it. But if you want to go this route, Creative Grids makes a couple of ultimate cat's cradle trim tools, and this one makes up to a 4-inch size, and this one makes up to an 8-inch size. And you can use these. Now, one word of warning: if you use these, they will come with instructions, and their instructions are oversized to trim down. If you want to use my instructions in these rulers, that works too, and I'm going to show you how to do both. All right, so now let's talk about the math. So let's take a closer look at the regular standard cat's cradle. So there's 3 bits of math we're going to do to get the 3 different pieces. So the regular cat's cradle, this square, where the math for that is the finished size of your square, of the whole cat's cradle square, divided by 2. So the finished size is 6. We're going to divide that by 2. We get 3. And then we're going to add 1/2 inch to make the seam allowance. So for this square, to make 2 cat's cradles at a time, you're going to need to cut 2 squares that are half the total finished size plus 1/2 inch. So for a 6-inch square, I'm going to cut 2 3.5-inch squares of whatever I'm going to put here in this square corner. For the small triangles, these we're going to cut as rectangles. The first measurement that you need to know, the small size of the rectangle, is going to be the same size as your square. So in this case, the small size, my square is 3.5. The small size of my rectangle is going to be 3.5. Now the lengthwise of the rectangle, the long size, add another 3/4 of an inch to the first measurement. So we'll have 3.5 plus 3/4 of an inch is 4.25. Okay. So and you're going to cut 2 of those rectangles. This big triangle is also a rectangle. The math for that is the short side is the finished size of the cat's cradle block. So in this case, we're making a 6-inch. So the finished size is 6. Just add a 1/2 inch. That's the short length of the rectangle. And then again, add 3/4 of an inch for the long size. So this triangle for a 6-inch cat's cradle, we're cutting to 6.5 by 7.25, and you only need 1 of those. So those are the math. I'll put some slides up with all the detailed math, and you can pause there so you can write that down. And then let's get started sewing. So we'll see you at the sewing machine. So here are the pieces I've cut to make two 6-inch cat's cradles. I have two small squares, which are 3.5 inches, two small rectangles, which are 3.5 by 4.25, and one large rectangle that is 6.5 by 7.25. Sew one square to the end of one small rectangle, right sides together, using a 1/4 inch seam, and repeat with the other square and rectangle. Open these strips and press the seam allowances towards the rectangle. Stack these two strips one on top of the other, right sides together, with the squares on the opposite ends. Do not nest the seams, instead match the ends of the strips. Sew these strips together along one long edge using a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Open this new rectangle and press the seam allowances towards the small rectangles. The seam allowance will twist in the center. This new rectangle should be the same size as the large rectangle you cut. This is where we're going to have an option of whether to use the Creative Grids Cat's Cradle ruler or any regular quilt ruler that has a 45-degree angle line on it. We're going to start with just the regular ruler. So place this piece wrong side up on your cutting mat and align your ruler so that the 45-degree angle line lines up with either an edge or any of the seams in this piece. The edge of the ruler should exactly cross the point of the seams that define the square, and the square should be fully underneath the ruler so that the edge of the ruler crosses diagonally across both small rectangles. Now just draw a line along that diagonal edge of your ruler. Let's look at how to do this with the Creative Grids Cat's Cradle tool. Take a look at your tool, find the lines on the tool that say place on seam line, and line those lines of the ruler up with the seams that define the small square. And then just draw a line along that diagonal edge of the ruler. Whichever method you use, on one edge, you're going to use the same on the other edge. I just did my examples using one of each. Stack this unit on top of the large rectangle that you cut, right sides together. Sew on the drawn lines. Make sure you maintain that twist of the seam allowance in the center. Cut the units apart between the seams by placing the 1/4 inch mark of any ruler on one seam and cutting. You can use a standard ruler, or you can use the Creative Grids Cat's Cradle tool, because on one edge you will see it says 1/4 inch seam allowance. So cut them apart with a 1/4 inch on one side, then take the second unit and you'll trim a small slither off to even up that seam allowance also to exactly 1/4 of an inch. Open the Cat's Cradle units and press the seam allowances towards the large triangle, then trim off the dog ears. Now we have two split Cat's Cradle units created. Let's talk about some variations on this. A split Cat's Cradle variation has a half square triangle in place of the plain square. There's a couple different ways you can do this. The first would be to actually make a half square triangle unit and put in place of the square. And the second would be to do a flip and fold corner over the top of the square after you have the Cat's Cradle block done. So let's take a look. First, I'll put up some math that you need to know to cut your split Cat's Cradle pieces. So here is the math to make your split Cat's Cradle blocks. Feel free to pause this slide and write it down, do the math. There are two methods of making split Cat's Cradles. If you want to make half square triangles in place of the small squares in the Cat's Cradle block, you do that first, and you'll need to cut one square of each fabric that is half the size of the finished Cat's Cradle plus 7/8 of an inch. And that will be instead of the small squares that you cut at the beginning for regular half Cat's Cradles. The other method is to do a flip and fold corner after you have done the regular Cat's Cradles. And in that case, you'll want to cut one square of contrasting fabric that is exactly the same size as your first squares you cut at the beginning of your cat's cradles. So that would be half the size of the finished cat's cradle plus 1/2 inch. And you'll need one of those squares per each regular cat's cradle that you're going to do a flip and fold corner onto to turn into a split cat's cradle. All right, let's start with doing the half square triangles before you start the rest of the cat's cradle. So again, I will link to the half square triangle tutorial. Here are the pieces that you're going to start with after you've made your half squares. Instead of having your two plain squares, you have two half squares, you have your two small rectangles, and your one large rectangle. So here are the half square triangles, and I've got them laid out next to, but not yet sewn to, the small rectangles. When you're using the half square triangles in place of the plain square, there is some directions and alignments to consider before you sew seams. Most of the time, you're going to want the half square triangle, the seam of the half square triangle, to cross across the corner of the finished cat's cradle. And then you just need to make sure that you have whichever color to the outside that you want. But you can also turn it 90 degrees and have the seam of the half square triangle going from the corner of the cat's cradle to the center of the cat's cradle. You just need to think about, which way do I lay this half square triangle before I sew it onto the small rectangle? And then you also need to look again, which way do I lay the two strips before I sew them together on whichever edge. So there's two places to check on that. So I've got them showing here laying out, and I'm making, in this example, I'm making one that has the half square seam going across the corner and one that has the half square seam going from corner to center, just so you can see the differences. So then I'm just going to time lapse through making the rest of this split cat's cradle block here. So right here, you see me checking again to make sure I'm going to be sewing the correct edges together on this, to make sure that I'm making these the correct way. Remember, I'm having one, which would be the top strip, going so that the half square triangle, the seam of the half square triangle crosses the corner, and the bottom strip, you see I have the seam of the half square triangle is going to go from the corner of the cat's cradle to the center. Now let's continue the time lapse. Everything else now is exactly the same as when we were making regular cat's cradle. So let's just continue the time lapse so you can see these finished blocks. Let's now take a look at the second way to create a split cat's cradle block. On this one, we're going to start with a finished regular cat's cradle, and we're going to do a flip and fold corner. So on this one, the only version of a split cat's cradle you'll get is the one where the seam crosses the corner of the cat's cradle. So again, the math is, you're going to cut a contrasting square that's exactly the same size as the square you cut for at the beginning. So it's going to be half of the finished size of the cat's cradle plus 1/2 inch. So this was a 6-inch cat's cradle. To split this cat's cradle, I'm going to cut a 3.5 inch contrasting square, and then simply draw a line across one of the diagonals of that square on the back. Place this contrasting square over the corner of the square of the cat's cradle, right sides together, and sew on the line. Trim the seam allowance to 1/4 inch, open the corner triangle, and press the seam allowance towards the corner of the block. This method does give you those extra triangles to cut off. You can waste them, or you can do like I did and create another extra little half square triangle that you can use elsewhere. All right, well, I hope you enjoyed learning how to make cat's cradle blocks and all of their various iterations of variations. These are all, um, they're a little complicated, but once you learn how, it's not that bad. And you actually can use this sort of technique for not just cat's cradles. There's other blocks that has something up here and a plain triangle, and you can kind of use that rectangle formula to figure out how to do that on that. So, like there's a block called, I can't remember the name of the block, but there's a block I've made that has a whole bunch of little half square triangles around and a little diamond, a little triangle here, and then a big triangle. And I use the same technique for that. So this is a really cool thing. Um, Again, there's two versions of this. You'll see only the slight difference up here in the corners, but these actually, once they're sewn in the quilt, they're going to look identical. And then this is a really cool one. I kind of like this one. So I hope you had fun making these blocks. If you like this video, if you're on YouTube, please give me a thumbs up, give me a comment. The algorithm loves that. Subscribe to my channel. If you're watching me on my website, you can go, if there's actually, you can pop it out and go to YouTube and do all those sorts of things. And we will see you next time. Thanks for watching.